This morning I'll be reading from the Gospel according to Luke. If you want to follow along in your own Bible here or at home, we'll be reading from the 17th chapter. I'll be starting in verse 11 and continuing on through 19. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And they went on, and they were clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. My wife Eleanor got a gift for Christmas, I think a number of years ago now, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. It's been a while. It was it's a really pretty picture frame. And we have it in our house, and she decided that she wanted to put it with some other pictures on her dresser. And that's where she has a picture of her mom and dad, pictures of our kids, some other family events. You know, we snapped a memorable photo, and we wanted to have that in our collection. And this new picture frame, or this new 4 or 5-year-old picture frame, that is. The thing about the picture frame is it's got an irregular sized shape photo spot. You know, when you buy a picture frame, they come in standard sizes, but sometimes you get one that's an irregular size, and it may be because the frame is really unique and interesting to you. But the hard part about that is then you've got to print a regular sized picture and then cut the appropriate sized picture out of that to put into this irregular shaped frame. And that's what we have here. We have a picture that's probably 3 by 3 instead of 5 by 7 or 3 by 5 or 8 by 10 or whatever the standard sizes are for photographs. And so as a result, the picture that sits to this day in the frame is the picture that comes with the frame. We haven't done it yet. We haven't taken the time to print the picture professionally and then cut it to the right size. And so we have this frame at home with a little boy sitting in a field of grass who has plucked up a dandelion that has now just turned to seeds, and he's blowing on it, and the seeds are scattering in the wind. It's a great picture, but it's like a stock photo. I mean, it's the one that came with the frame. And quite honestly, we just left it there and forgot about it. Well, about a year ago, my son Wes came into our bedroom, and we were having a conversation, and he interrupted and said, "Who's that kid?" And I said, "Who are you talking about?" We looked over at the frame, and well, I'll be darned, there's this boy blowing away a dandelion and have no idea who he is. Some child model. Or we probably could have made up a story about he's a half-brother that he didn't know existed or something like that, but we decided to just tell him, we don't know. Fact of the matter is, time came and went. We forgot to put a picture in the frame, but the frame has joined the other family photos over time. You know, this kind of thing just happens, doesn't it? I mean, not that necessarily, but the idea that something, you don't do something about it, and it just, all of a sudden it's an out of sight, out of mind, or you pass by it so often that you stop noticing anymore. It doesn't have to do with just objects, but just in general, things in our lives. How many times have you gone into a place and you immediately noticed something, but the people who pass it every day failed to see it and have failed to see it for years and years? What about after you've come home from some time of being away and you recognize that there was something that you hadn't noticed, but because there had been a certain amount of time that has elapsed, it has become different to you, or you're seeing it with fresh eyes? Maybe some of you who have been coming back to in-person worship have come back into the church building for the first time in many months, and you've noticed things with fresh eyes again. Or what if, because we've been talking a lot about gratitude, what if it's something that has become so commonplace to you that you have failed to show the appropriate appreciation for what it is that has been before your eyes for a very long time. Now, I don't know about you, but it's not that I've taken things for granted. It's just that maybe I've taken for granted that life just goes on and things have suddenly stopped being noticed by me. Maybe the things that I am most deeply grateful for in my life, I forget to say thank you for the most often. Does that happen with you? The things that have just become so much a part of your routine and your life that you just stop offering the kind of gratitude for them that you probably should, because they're the things that are there day in and day out. What about the fact that you woke up healthy enough to attend worship this morning? What about the people that you share your life with? What about the power and the commitment of the relationships that you are in? What about the significance of having a home or a bed that you woke up in? Or the fact that you're probably going to eat lunch today, and it's just an assumption or a given that that's going to happen. You'll probably eat another couple of times before the day is over. These are the kinds of things that if we start to pick apart our lives and look at how much we have to be grateful for, we start to see our lives in the world in a very different way. But because those things are just a part of our daily routines, we fail to notice them. It's like that picture frame on the dresser that went there for a couple of years before anybody ever pointed out that we never put a picture in it. So in this story today, the story from Luke's gospel, we have a story of Jesus and his encounter with a group of lepers. Now, we know that people with leprosy, or as we would call it today, Hansen's disease, have this skin disease, and they have, apparently this was something that was fairly common in Jesus' time, because as Jesus is traveling throughout the countryside, he regularly runs into people who have this skin malady. And one of the things that we know about Jesus' time period is that those people had to be removed from the rest of society for a couple of different reasons. One, obviously, they had this illness, and people were afraid that they would contract this illness if they were around them. And so there was a social distancing before social distancing was a thing that had to happen with these people that had leprosy and the rest of society, the rest of the community. And so leper communities or leper colonies were established, and they would have to live well outside the rest of the community where the people had gathered. So if we think 6 feet of social distance is a little bit rough, lepers in Jesus' time were to be kept at 16 feet or more away. And when you think about how people lived, where many people would share a single bedroom for sleeping quarters, or how often we would congregate in the kitchen of our own houses, for example, and you think about the distance that would have to have been kept at 16 feet, it made it impossible. And not only that, but people didn't sprawl out. Even in the small towns, people were living in relatively close proximity to one another. So it was impossible to maintain that 16-foot distance. And so as a result, people had to live outside, or they lived out in the country. They lived in the hillsides or in the caves or in makeshift houses, and that's where these people had to be. But not only was it because of the infectiousness and the contagiousness of their disease, but there was also this ritual impurity that said that if you had one of these illnesses, you were ritually unclean, which meant that you would infect ritually the people around you, and anybody in close proximity would also be unclean, which means that you couldn't participate in regular acts of worship. And so, we hear in the story today, Jesus is walking from Galilee and making his way to Jerusalem. And it's another one of those instances where walking through the countryside, he comes within earshot of a group of lepers who are living together. 10 of them, to be specific. And as he's coming close to them, he hears them call out to him, and they say, "Jesus, have mercy on us." And Jesus is intrigued. And he goes over to see them. Now, we don't know this at the time, this part in the story, but we find out later that the one who will come back is a Samaritan. So when we hear that part of the story, it's immediately supposed to call us back to the 10th chapter of Luke, where we find the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan. So let's go there for just a second. I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but this all comes together. So the story that Jesus tells of the story of the Good Samaritan, you remember this story. It's one of the most well-known stories that Jesus tells, a beloved story in our tradition. A man is robbed and left for dead by the side of the road. And 2 different times, 2 people who should have stopped and had compassion on him pass by him. In fact, even seeing him and going to the other side of the road to pass by him so that they will not, A, have to deal with the Samaritan, who were the arch enemies of the Jews, and B, so that they would not be made ritually unclean as they came within proximity of the man who was injured. Because he had open wounds. There was blood involved, and people who would have touched him would have become ritually unclean for a period of time. The one who does come to his aid, as we find out, is a Samaritan man, the least likely candidate, the one who probably should have crossed to the other side of the road. Jews and Samaritans don't mix. Touching somebody else of the other kind does not mix. And so we have all of this backstory. And Jesus said, who is the man who was the neighbor to him, to the man who was injured? The Samaritan was. The one who actually didn't just see him, but whose heart was filled with compassion for him and responded to his needs. So Jesus now, in this story, has a moment where he not only hears the lepers calling out to him, but he sees them in the same way that the Samaritan in the story of the Good Samaritan sees the people in need. Now all of a sudden, Jesus' teaching as a parable is coming true in real life. How will Jesus model how one is to respond in a situation like this? So Jesus is walking by, he hears 10 voices calling out to him. He responds by not only seeing them, but heeding what they are saying, paying attention to them, and going over and filled with compassion responds to them. And so he says to them, "Go now and see the priest." So they do. Now, why in the world would he go see a priest? Well, because it has to do with that ritually impure, that ritually unclean state that these men find themselves in. So the first task that they must do is, if you want to rejoin society, healed from your leprosy, the first thing that you have to do is show yourself to the priest, who will then pronounce you ritually clean. You'll have to pass the sight test on whether or not you've been healed. So that's where their first stop is. Before they can go to see friends and family, before they can go join the community again, they got to go see the priest, who will sign off on the whole thing of them being clean. And as they start to go and walk away, we find that as the story is told, that as they are walking, they begin to recognize that their bodies are being healed. So as they are, as the song said, as they are dead man walking, they are healed. And they begin to run and go to show themselves to the priest. But the one stops dead in his tracks, turns around and says, "I need to go back and say thank you. I need to go back and show my gratitude." And as it happens, this man is all what? A Samaritan. Again, the most unlikely person in the story to turn around, dead in his tracks, is the Samaritan, and that's the one who does this. Now, here's another little thing to notice in the text. I'm going to read it actually for you, because there's some things that are in this story that I think are really fascinating as far as biblical clues for us. So remember, as Jesus is walking on his way, keeping their distance, the 10 lepers called out. They called out to Jesus. It doesn't say they screamed. It doesn't say that they yelled. It just says that they called out to him audibly. But then when this Samaritan is healed, it says that when he saw that he was healed, he turned back praising God in a loud voice. In a loud voice. Which begs the question of all of us. Are our thank yous as loud and as fervent as our pleases? In other words, are we as likely to have a response of gratitude that was in keeping with the kind of response for the appeal that we initially had? I think some of us are so much more likely to say, "Please, can I, may I, give me, I want it." And then when we get it, Does our thank you, does our expression of gratitude match up with the kind of petition or appeal that we made going into it? I think the answer is probably no, which is the same kind of way that we are far more likely to come up with a list of things that are our prayer concerns or our prayer petitions, and not as long of a list of the things that are our prayers of gratitude. It's part of just who we are. It's part of human nature, but it's also something that we can work against. We can work back against that. We can fight that natural inclination within ourselves to look at the negative side or to look at the list of things that are our grievances instead of our blessings. And when I think we begin to make that shift, it can have a deeply powerful impact on our lives. So, 2 weeks ago, I talked to you about the man who tried to thank everybody that was involved with his morning cup of coffee, and he recognized that he had to thank over 1,000 people in the process. Last week, I talked to you about what some of the leading psychologists say about how we can have a more positive attitude, and that begins with gratitude, and how that can truly turn our lives around and reshape us. Jesus offers now something altogether different, but in keeping with that today, where he reminds us, and these are not so much his words, but I think what the story is ultimately pointing to, is that the difference between a gift and a blessing is whether or not there is an expression of gratitude that follows. So, as I was reading the text and as I was doing some more research on the story this week, I came across this quote by Alan Culpepper. He's a professor of biblical studies in Georgia, and here's a quote that he had, and I'm gonna ask that we look at this together. Now, he says about this particular passage of Scripture, the surprisingly subtle story ends with the repetition of Jesus' formula of blessing. So he's saying that when we look to the Gospels, and particularly in the Gospel of Luke, whenever Jesus pronounces a blessing, it seems to have these same words in common. Your faith has saved you, or your faith has made you well. Things along these lines. This is Jesus' blessing. In this case, the man's faith was not expressed by his request for help, but by his gratitude and praise of God. The other 9 lepers had been healed, but only this one received Jesus' declaration of salvation. They got what they wanted, but this one received more than he had dreamed of asking for. The others said, Jesus, have mercy on us. Jesus said, show yourself to the priest. And as they were walking, they were healed. The 10th one, the Samaritan, was not only healed, but when he returned and offered an expression of thanks and praising God for what had happened, he was not only healed, but he was saved because his faith showed his gratitude. And when he recognized the fullness of what had happened, it was more than a gift, it was a blessing. Do you think sometimes that when you consider what it is that you are most deeply, most powerfully, most profoundly grateful for in your life, if you offer an expression of gratitude or thanksgiving for that, doesn't that make it all the richer for you? I believe that a blessing is only fully realized when we offer our thanks and praise for that blessing. Without that, it's easily something that can slip into the woodwork, something that we stop noticing, something that we fail to recognize with appropriateness how important that thing is to our lives. But when we pause and we not only recognize this thing before us, but we offer our expressions of gratitude and thanksgiving for it, then the fullness of that blessing comes to light. We recognize it and truly respond with the kind of recognition and response that it is worthy of, that it merits. I hope that this week, as you pray, you'll do what we did at the beginning of worship. Take all of those things that would be that laundry list of things that are concerns for events or individuals. And instead, think about them in terms of the way that God has been a blessing in those, or that you can be a blessing within those. And this is not an attempt, again, to whitewash things away. This is not a Pollyanna-ish kind of faith. But this is instead saying, how am I going to recognize God's ongoing work, even in the midst of the most difficult and strugglesome things in my lives? How can that change our mindset so that we can live a life of gratitude? And how will that then reshape how we choose to face each and every day? So with this week, Thanksgiving on Thursday, and the days leading up to it, here's the challenge: that we might see with our eyes the blessings that are before us, that we might feel in the depth of our hearts the grace and the gratitude that we have, and may our lips express our thanksgiving to God for the many blessings that have been offered to us.